Yes, a very good morning once again. And morning at NTV. We are during to hold a national prayer of unity. Yes, the national prayer of unity, and that is going to be tomorrow, the 31st. It's going to be a Saturday. This country is going to be praying for unity during these times of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's one thing, yes, to actually have the knowledge about this pandemic as government, and it's another to engage other stakeholders. That's what we are saying. We need to be getting 2 cents from the opposition, FDC, UPCDP. What kind of interventions do they think will be able to alleviate the challenges that many Ugandans are grappling with during this COVID-19 pandemic? And how can we, egg government on to actually listen to the recommendations coming in from the opposition? That's the only way we can achieve normalcy returning to this country. Elena Kembabazi's connection has been rectified. She's right here with us on Morning at NTV yet again. A very good morning once again, Elena Kembabazi. There she is. Let's talk about whether or not our people have learned anything. The people in government, have they learned anything in these lockdowns? And if they haven't, why? Because you saw what happened in the first lockdown. We locked people up, we reopened. Yes, cases had gone down during the lockdown, but when we reopened, cases went up. Now, on another lockdown, which has just expired, we didn't do any vaccinations. And even though we were to reopen on Saturday or Sunday, cases would rise. Why? People were never vaccinated. So why is it that we never learn from these lockdowns, Elena Kembabazi?
I think we keep treating COVID like it's this thing where we solve it once and it goes, and yet they know that COVID is here to stay. I don't know if there's a lack of government coordination or a lack of political will, but to date, I do not see strong commitments about making sure that things like testing or vaccination are widely available, especially for the most marginalized. I think part of the challenge in this country is we have this mentality that we can just take care of our interests, the elite, those in power, and the others will get to them later. But that's not how you handle a pandemic. Trickle down does not work in a pandemic. And I gave you an example of vaccination, what they're proposing, where they say we are going to give companies that have money the opportunity to get vaccines, and then, yes, we'll get to the rest. What is that? How do you even come up with that? Serious? We have just a widespread death. Right? And so ensuring that there's adequate testing everywhere, we still don't hear those things. Ensuring that even if you locked down, if you had to lock down people, first of all, that there's public trust that you have done everything possible. It's a last resort. Like you have strengthened the health system. They have seen where the COVID money has been going. They have seen where the donations are going. And I'm not sure we're there. And I gave you an example again of Rwanda. You start off with saying, we don't even, when we're going into lockdown, we did not know how many, like the actual sense of COVID in the community. We have been focusing here, people who can go for tests. In the rural areas, they're not going for tests because sometimes you have to literally go, even sometimes across the districts. We used to document those stories in lockdown of people having to go like from deep in the west to like Mbarara to get a COVID test, and they've been dropping dead or treating themselves with herbs. Now you're going to open up everything again. But how do we make sure we're not here again? Why can't you make widespread mass testing available? Why can't we have widespread vaccination where the government is actually the one in charge of this, making sure taxpayers' money or other donations are being used properly to vaccinate without these things of if you have money, you bring here, I give you some. That is not how we are supposed to work. And then also come up with a proper plan. Like I've said so many times. Ugandans, in some of the areas I've been, people even refuse to, they say this lockdown is just to lock us down the poor. So now the next time you have a lockdown, you saw what happened in South Africa. Yes, South Africa has had inequality, Zuma, but part of what happened in South Africa was triggered by having a lockdown for that long and feeling like government didn't have a proper plan to avoid other lockdowns. And I am warning policymakers, you squandered the last chance. This chance, you should have done something more. I want to hear from the president tonight the plans for mass vaccination that are proper, concrete. How many people actually got vaccines in this lockdown? Yes, and how did they take measures to make sure that people are able to access them regardless of whether or not they can move long distances or have to, have some deep pockets somewhere. The other thing they should talk to us about is, again, their plan to support the businesses that that have been struggling, that they crippled by the lockdown. They're not going to wake up and
And then Mbabasi, Program Manager at the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. She's saying we should ramp up these tests because they couldn't be only 1.4 million tests in this country. Because if we are targeting 21.9 million people with these vaccinations, we should have tested these individuals. Before vaccinating the 22 million Ugandans, we should have tested them before vaccinating them. But then guess what? We've only conducted 1.4 million tests within this country. And we cannot be saying that we only have 93,282 cases of COVID-19, because if you ramp up these tests, you'd realize that there are more coronavirus cases languishing or lying around in many of the jurisdictions right here within Uganda. In the respect of, diversifying this conversation to also focus on the education and the impact of COVID-19 on the education, I have Mr. Philbert Baguma, the Secretary General of the Uganda National Teachers Union, who is joining me right now on set. Very good morning, Mr. Baguma.
Good morning, sir.
All right. I'm sure you are one of the individuals who are clamoring to have this reopening so that schools can actually get back to normal, so that our students can get back into that school setting. But largely, how have these lockdowns, not the latest one, but lockdowns as a whole, COVID-19, how has it affected the education sector before we even get to the UCE results?
Obviously, it has jeopardized the education system.
Indeed.
And it has psychologically tortured the teachers, the learners, parents, and guardians. Teachers are supposed to be in class teaching.
Yes.
The parents expect their children to be in school. And so is the guardians and the sponsors.
Indeed.
They are at home and things are not doing well at home. And this COVID-19 pandemic has proved that surely the safest place for the learners is the school, not the home where they are where they are with their parents. Because children we have had so many scenarios. Children have gone into child labor. Children have been defiled. Children have been impregnated. Children have been married off. And others have been sexually abused. And therefore, in a nutshell, you will realize that children have suffered more when they are at home than when they use it to be in school.
Do you think this government has had a clear plan on the resuscitation of education institutions within this country? Because largely, according to some experts I was talking to, they're saying government didn't have a plan even for the reopening of the schools, because we should have seen vaccinations take center stage fast within the school settings. That 10 million learners should have been inoculated, so that when we reopen the economy, we first focus on the students. But then even in the lockdown, that did not happen. So meaning the uncertainty about the reopening of schools is actually being compounded more with this fact. We did not vaccinate during the lockdown, so we actually anticipate that the lockdown on schools might continue. But what is your perception?
First of all, lockdown is a good measure to stop the spread of COVID-19. But while in lockdown, what you are supposed to do, if it is not done, then you are more or less
going back into the same position.
50-50, because you are not preparing life after lockdown. So if you are in a lockdown, you are supposed to prepare for life after lockdown.
Indeed.
And the moment you don't prepare for it, then it means you are only looking at the lockdown. You will come out of the lockdown and enter into another lockdown.
Indeed.
Because the situation remains the same.
Without vaccinations.
And therefore, government has not really concentrated on making sure that vaccination is done.
Doesn't this make the
lockdown.
education sector's reopening more uncertain, Mr. Baguma?
Obviously, you recall when the president last addressed the nation, he made a directive that all teachers must be vaccinated before going to classroom. Now, the vaccines are nowhere to be seen. So how do you expect now the reopening of schools?
Philbert Baguma is the Secretary General of the Uganda National Teachers Union. We also have news coming in from Koboko, and we'd like to get an update on the state of education within that jurisdiction now that we are releasing UCE exams today. Mr. Rashola did a very good morning. Some 333,880 plus candidates sat for these exams, but largely give me an update on what is happening within the Koboko jurisdiction.
Yeah, a very good morning to me in the studio and the team in the studio with our audience. I'm coming to you live from Koboko district. As today, the Minister of Education and Sports will be releasing these results. Many of these candidates who sat in the year 2020 expecting their results. Coming to Koboko, the district managed to register a total of, for those ones who sat for UCE, the district registered around 410 candidates who sat for UCE 2020, and then Koboko municipality registered a total of 1,191. These are the candidates who are expecting their results as today the minister will be releasing these results officially. But Romeo, however, what I have to tell you is that looking at this particular enrollment or the total number of candidates who sat for UCE in the year 2020, the number has drastically reduced compared to the total number of candidates who sat in 2019. In 2019, the municipality registered a total of 2,148. But when you look at those who sat in 2020, the total who sat are 1,191, meaning that there's reduction or the number of learners who registered for the examinations reduced. And then for the district, in 2019, the district registered around 681 candidates who sat for these examinations. But in 2020, where the results will be released today, the total number of candidates who sat are 410. So this is the statistics, and these are the numbers of candidates who are expecting their results today. Many whom I interacted with are expectant, and of course are looking at how the journey was for them with the interruption of classes due to the outbreak of this deadly pandemic. Most of them are expecting that their performance will not meet the expectations. And also some of the education experts within the district are saying that due to the interruptions of lessons and some of the district-owned examinations, the performance might not be like the one of 2019. Romeo, that's what is in Koboko.
Rashola, did it also paint for me a picture of what is happening within Koboko district as far as education is concerned? Do you feel like the learners within that jurisdiction are losing interest in education now that they've been at home for a long time? What about the parents? Overall, what is the mood?
Yeah, the picture in Koboko is that when you look at the education system, let me first talk about the education system. People, like most of the people, don't consider completion of the education cycle. Mostly I find that when a child has started after around P7, mostly they consider that they have completed the level, and at the end of the day, they don't complete up to senior 4. But looking at the performance of the district for the past 3 years, you find that in the region, the district has been performing either in the 3rd or 4th number. And when you look at West Nile region, we have around 9 districts.
Didi coming to us live from Koboko as we wait for the UCE results to be released today, the Uganda Certificate of Education results. I also do have Mr. Philbert Baguma, the Secretary General of Uganda National Teachers Union. He's still with us here to talk about what kind of impact these lockdowns have on the education system. Students seem to be losing a lot of interest in this education system, and many of the experts envisage a situation whereby even though we reopen, we won't have many of the students that we had before, as many drop out as a result of the factors that you just mentioned: child marriages, teenage pregnancies, and so forth. Do you think it will get worse if we extend this lockdown, Mr. Baguma?
First of all, the lockdowns are necessary to curb the spread of COVID-19. But we need to have the discussion ongoing about the education of the children. Because the moment we stop talking about education, the teaching and learning process, then we are making the bad situation worse. Because children are psychologically tortured, parents and guardians are psychologically tortured, and therefore we need to keep this discussion ongoing so that they know that even when we are in lockdown, there is hope for going back to school. But the moment we keep quiet, then it makes matters worse. So as we struggle to contain the spread of COVID-19, we need to have the discussion on the education of the learners ongoing, so that they have hope and know that yes, we were supposed to go back to school in July. We couldn't go because of the hike in numbers, and therefore possibly the next option will be September. If September doesn't work, then it is common knowledge that at that time the situation does not warranty going back to school. And then you can always do that. Now, we need to have a serious campaign about identifying those learners who have gone into child labor, those who have been impregnated, those who have been forced into marriages, and those who have gone into other child abuses, so that we track them and bring them back. At the time of reopening schools, we bring them back to the formal education system. Or if we find they cannot join the formal education system, then we can look for the alternative, which is vocational. But we need to have these children come back, because the numbers are huge, and therefore if we risk leaving these children where they are, it will be a disaster to the country and the development of this country.
Philbert Baguma, the Secretary General, Uganda National Teachers Union. Let's also bring in Elena Kembabazi, the Program Manager, Right to Health at the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. Elena Kembabazi, what do we gain largely from these lockdowns that have no plans? Our students are largely at home. We didn't conduct vaccinations, so meaning even though we were to reopen, we are not sending them back to that school setting where there are mass concentrations.
I agree, and ISA does work across the board, including education. And from an education perspective, I agree with the prior speaker. It's the impact of these lockdowns is devastating for kids' access to education, especially the poor, who are not able to do your online learning, and they can't afford, and they often don't get the materials to ensure continuity of learning. And even when they closed schools, because they, again, did it abruptly, it's not that the schools had given them packages or had time to prepare, right? So again, we are back to where we were last year. And what did we learn from last year? Our research found child labor increased. It found that learning outcomes were really put at risk, particularly for the lower primary classes. And now, in line with the fact that we haven't done adequate testing, we haven't done adequate vaccination, and kids have not been learning during this time, we're very, very worried about the education sector and our kids learning. We think that if there was a way, they should be, again, we need to stop this knee-jerk reaction. This is the second time around. So we need to know by now, what is the plan? What are we going to do different? How are we going to make sure when schools eventually open, you're not going to have the same upsurge in cases undetected? The last time, schools just sat there. I had a niece who they kept calling it pneumonia, and they hid it. By the time schools got out, we had to admit her in hospital, right? This is a teenager over COVID. And so I think that we need to have thought about, is the government, does it have a proper plan to make sure that schools will reopen, and they will reopen safely? Because those two things have to happen. If schools don't reopen, the poor are just not going to learn. But how are you doing it? And how are you making sure, again, prioritizing vaccination, testing, prioritizing regulation? Even right now, the private schools are able to some of them have been cutting corners here and there, doing all kinds of things. Remember, the Ministry of Education had put out an advisory to say you can't talk about S1 enrollment and all others because they've been doing so. It is the kids in the government schools that are stuck. And so when you don't say anything, when you keep quiet, the ones you're actually hurting are the poor. Those with means will always find corners. International schools continue, but it is the poor. And so we need to have a proper, again, reopening plan. We should even already have had it, like the speaker said. Even if we say September, these are the measures we're taking between now and then, we should have done that. They're getting the data on the daily about, and again, because they're not serious about testing, but even with the testing they're doing, they're getting the data on the daily to say, okay, this is where it is. They should be able to know, okay, is it more in the rural areas or here? Is it what? And what does it mean? And how do you, again, you have to employ all kinds of things. Are you going to have to rethink how classes are done? We were doing a rotational system. Will that have to change? Will things have to be done more outdoors? Will you insist on better ventilation? What is the plan? The education one is a very hard one. So the earlier they start talking about the plan and consulting parents, because that's the thing in Uganda. We do a lot of policy very quickly, top down, with little participation from the people who are supposed to benefit. So if you sit there and then you wait and when they open, okay, now we can talk about schools. No, you start the process early. And for parents whose kids are out of school, it's disheartening. For the poor kids, I'm telling you right now, you're going to see what happened last time. They opened, the kids were out on the streets selling things. And many of them told us, what do we do? What do we do at home? We stay home and watch people starve, especially when our parents are in some of the sectors that are not even allowed to work. So the silence on education is putting the education system in crisis, and it's hurting our poor children.
Regard the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had numerous or immense psychological distress on our learners. You being the program manager, Right to Health, let's focus on the health aspect. How has the COVID-19 pandemic wrought a lot of psychological distress on our learners? And let's talk to the policymakers who are watching the show right now and show them why we should be reopening, because when they are in this lockdown, the stress is too much. So what kind of impact has this COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns had on our learners, the psychological distress, mental health?
Yeah, first of all, I think COVID and the way it played out in this lockdown had psychological distress on everyone. Now imagine young people. You're watching people die, you're hearing about hospitals, all of that. Then your parents are at home, they don't have money, they are stressed, they are anxious, and sometimes they take out the violence on the kids. The girls in particular have been very vulnerable to sexual harassment, and are often unable to study even if they got some materials, because again, they carry the burden of domestic work, knowing how we have structured these societies. And for so many, home is not a safe place. And we have to recognize that, right? Which means that we have to have a real plan on how to make it safe to reopen, because we will have to reopen at some point. But I also think that, again, we're not talking enough about mental health, particularly for young people during this time, and especially in light of the overwhelming grief. We had a vigil for people who had lost loved ones, and grown-ups broke down and said we need psychosocial support. We have been living in fear and there's a lot of grief. And the young people, they talked about the impact on their kids. And I don't know that the ministry it's done some things on grief and mental health. I don't know that they're targeting young people. And also the loneliness that happens. You do a lot of your social interaction at school. And for the younger classes where they were playing with their friends, and now there's the idea that there's this big bad disease out there. Again, we're not doing enough to reach their psychosocial and mental needs. And again, those anxieties spill over, because even when schools open, if you're anxious, first of all, about the practical things, will there be fees? Will my parents be able to afford my fees? But also, or what if I get sick again? Remember, these are the kids who got sick in school.
All right, thank you very much, Elena Kembabazi, for those insights. She is the program manager, Right to Health, at the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. Philbert Baguma is still here. Would like to know what kind of recommendations are coming in from the teachers. We need to hear from those stakeholders, the Uganda National Teachers Union. What are the recommendations or the ideas coming in from the teachers? What do you have to say about how we can proceed after this lockdown?
First of all, we need wider consultations.
I hear you on that one.
Because this is not a monotony of the Ministry of Education and Sports.
Thank you.
We have so many stakeholders who are supposed to get involved in this. Because of this psychological torture, the parents, every parent you meet is asking, is it likely that our children will go back to school? And when will that be?
Uncertainty.
Others are proposing and saying, let's forget about this year and we begin next year normally as we have always done.
What are the teachers saying?
Of course, the teachers are the most hurt. You know you are supposed to teach, and that is your duty. But you cannot teach because of the circumstances. You know the children are supposed to learn.
Of course, we have been focusing on the children, but even the impact on the teachers.
And you cannot support them. You cannot facilitate the teaching and learning process. And therefore, it becomes worse. So, government needs to engage the stakeholders into the discussion of the way forward in terms of education. What is it that we are supposed to do so that the parents can get the hope of the education of their children? The learners can also have hope that at some time they are going to go back to school. The teachers can get hope that, yes, we are at home, but we are hoping to go back to school. Now, if we don't do that, the lockdowns will come lockdown after lockdown, and the situation will be the same. Because when we go to lockdowns and we don't do things differently, then it remains the same.
Then we go back to zero. Philbert Baguma, the Secretary General of the Uganda National Teachers Union, thank you very much for having made the time to speak to us. You're a very busy man, but still you spared some time for Morning at NTV and the country. Yes. And indeed. Also, Elena Kembabazi from ISA, thank you very much for having made the time to speak to us. You've been so kind to spare some time for us. Your country still needs you. Please protect yourself, Elena.
Thank you, Romeo.
Indeed. Pandemic is still raging. Of course, Stephen Mbide is on standby to engage us on the ground. He's in Kabalagala. Very good morning, Mr. Stephen Mbide. Yes, we shall get to you shortly after this break so that you can acquaint us on what is happening on the ground. Good morning, but stay with us.